My background is in journalism. I'm a radio journalist. I worked in RT for about 16 years. I'm also a doctoral student here in DIT and a lecturer. And my research, I'm doing doctoral research here in DIT, and my research concerns the topic of refugees and asylum seekers and the difficulties they may have in having their stories heard in the public domain, and looking at my own work as a journalist and how the media actually covers the issue of asylum and refugee. But what is noticeable about the media coverage, both in the Irish media and the British media, which is the media that I would follow most, is that there is very much a singular perspective in the way it's covered. Obviously it's a tragic story, people coming from Africa, from Syria, from war-torn situations, from really bad economic situations, trying to get to Europe and risking their lives. The fact, though, is that the reason that they have to risk their lives is because there are very strict regulations in Europe. If you're somebody coming to Europe from outside the EU, it's virtually impossible to get into Europe. And that's called Fortress Europe. These laws were developed over a period of time, and Ireland is party to these laws, which make it very, very difficult for people to come, in particular from Africa and from the Middle East, to come to Ireland and to the EU. So what's happening in the Mediterranean, in a sense, is a consequence of this legislation. And while the media, and that's what we do as journalists, we cover the human story, and the media has focused on the tragedy of those people coming in flimsy boats who are caught in the Mediterranean, often who have drowned, instead maybe it's too difficult to look at what is actually causing people to come to Europe. They touch on that issue, they talk about war and difficult circumstances, but I think it might be useful to look at President Michael D's speech in the Lebanon, which he gave recently, and he really named it. He talked about the EU's monstrous policies, and he connected what is happening today in Europe, in the Mediterranean, to colonial and post-colonial policies. Well, I think Ireland should take more people. I can't remember the number, but we're taking a very small number of people in refugee settlement programs. Like, for example, there's so much, if you look at what David Cameron said, there's so much hypocrisy. Politicians, were making statements when people drowned a few weeks ago, when we saw the large numbers of people coming to Europe or trying to come to Europe. Politicians said, how dreadful it was and how sorry they were, but on the other hand, they're taking very few people on refugee settlement programs, and those are programs where people actually can come from the country directly. In Africa or in Syria, they can come directly to a country in the EU for protection, and I think Britain is taking 150 people through that programme, and Ireland, I'm not sure of the number, but it's very small. So yes, the answer is yes, we could take more people, but it's not uncomplex. It is a difficult issue, and particularly in times of austerity, when you have far-right parties and right-wing parties, political parties, using the issue of migration. The impact of EU policy is that it's extremely difficult for migrants, for people who are not born within the EU, who are not citizens of the EU, to actually gain access to the EU. So many people coming from outside the EU, coming from outside Fortress Europe, have to either come through the asylum process, and that's a long and difficult process where one is recognised or not recognised as a refugee, or come as a migrant, apply for a job, which again is very difficult. Or what happens is many people, thousands and thousands of people, and we don't even know the numbers, it's estimated there are 30,000 people who are undocumented living in Ireland, and those are people who do not have any status within Ireland. So they have to work often for very low wages. They're very much at risk of being exploited. So the consequences of EU migration policy are disastrous for many people.